She was nobody, a name on a bracket that nobody clicked, a ranking that nobody bothered to remember. Eala, ranked 29th in the world, was the kind of player you'd scroll past on the WTA website without a second glance. She wasn't winning Grand Slams. She wasn't headlining marquee matches at Wimbledon or the Australian Open. She wasn't the face of tennis that ESPN was building their primetime narratives around. But in March 2024, something shifted, something unexpected, something that would eventually shake the entire foundation of how brands valued women's tennis. The sponsorship offers started arriving like dominoes falling in slow motion. First came a whisper, a major Asian apparel brand watching her perform in regional tournaments, then another, then another. By week 3, the numbers were staggering. By month's end, Eala had secured approximately $600 million in sponsorship commitments across multiple sectors: athletic wear, energy drinks, tech companies, mobile apps, and luxury brands hungry for authentic Asian representation in global markets. In 30 days. 1 month. The same time it takes to watch a tennis season unfold had completely rewritten her financial destiny. The narrative nobody saw coming wasn't about her rankings. It wasn't about her trophy case or her Grand Slam victories, because she didn't have any yet. It was about something far more valuable in the modern era: authenticity, market penetration, and the untapped goldmine of Asian tennis fandom. Ayla represented something that brands had been desperately searching for: a face that could bridge Eastern and Western markets, a voice that could speak to Gen Z across multiple continents, and a story so compelling that it sold itself. What made this moment so seismic wasn't just the number, it was who it was happening to. A young athlete from the Philippines climbing through the rankings without the pedigree of a Serena Williams, without the marketing machine of a Maria Sharapova, without the established celebrity that comes from years of being forced into the spotlight. Ayla had earned her seat at the table through pure, undeniable market value. Sponsors weren't investing in her past achievements, they were betting on her future. They were betting on what she would become. The tennis establishment watched in stunned silence. How had this happened? How had a 29th ranked player, someone technically outside the sport's elite circle, managed to command deals that rivaled and in some cases exceeded those of established stars? The answer lay in the data that sponsors obsessively analyzed: fan engagement rates, social media reach across crucial demographics, organic growth, cultural relevance, market gaps that had been overlooked for decades. Ayla didn't just fill a role in women's tennis, she opened a door to an entirely new revenue stream. But there was another story brewing beneath the surface, one that would eventually overshadow even Ayla's astronomical rise. Because while this young Filipino sensation was ascending at lightning speed, another player, the world number 1, the reigning Grand Slam champion, the player who supposedly had it all, was conspicuously absent from the sponsorship gold rush. Sabalenka, the undisputed queen of women's tennis, was struggling to secure comparable endorsement deals. The contrast was so stark, so undeniable, that it became impossible to ignore. And when the tennis world finally paid attention to this disparity, the backlash was immediate, visceral, and unprecedented. How could the best player in the world have nothing while a rising star had everything? Sabalenka had conquered tennis in ways that seemed insurmountable just years earlier. 2 Grand Slam titles, world number 1 ranking, prize money that eclipsed most of her peers, the kind of dominance that comes along once in a generation. She had defeated her rivals on the court with a ferocity that was almost intimidating. Her serve was a weapon. Her forehand was a masterclass. Her mental toughness in crucial moments was the stuff of legend. But there was a problem hiding beneath all this success, a problem that no amount of ranking points or trophy cases could solve. The sponsorship world wasn't calling. This wasn't hyperbole. This was the confusing, frustrating reality that Sabalenka faced as 2024 progressed. While players ranked lower than her, players with fewer accomplishments, fewer titles, fewer accolades, were receiving seven-figure endorsement deals. Sabalenka's phone wasn't ringing the same intensity. The brands that should have been lining up to attach their logos to the world number one instead were exploring other options. They were looking at younger players, at players with broader global appeal, at players who represented markets that were suddenly hot commodities. The disconnect was staggering. In traditional sports marketing logic, this made no sense. Sponsorship deals should be flowing towards champions. They're supposed to reward excellence. They're supposed to be the financial crown jewel placed atop the trophy case of athletic dominance. Yet, here was Sabalenka, arguably the best female tennis player on the planet, struggling to command the endorsement landscape in the way her ranking and achievements suggested she should. What was happening? Why were brands pivoting away from the world number one? The answer was multifaceted, complex, and deeply uncomfortable for traditional tennis stakeholders to discuss. First, there was the issue of perceived marketability versus actual market demand. Sabalenka, while undeniably talented and successful, wasn't the kind of athlete that brands felt could authentically cross over into lifestyle, fashion, or consumer technology markets. She was a tennis player, an incredible one, but when brands imagined her face on their products, when they ran focus groups and analyzed demographic data, something wasn't clicking. The authenticity wasn't there. The cultural resonance was limited. Second, there was the geographic reality that nobody wanted to admit. Sabalenka's fan base, while passionate and dedicated, was concentrated in specific regions. Eastern Europe provided strong support, tennis traditionalists championed her, but she lacked the pan-Asian appeal that was suddenly the most valuable commodity in global marketing. She didn't represent a demographic breakout. She didn't open doors to untapped markets. She was, in many ways, a completion of an existing market rather than a frontier. Third, and this is where the story becomes genuinely difficult, there were whispers about personality, relatability, and brand fit. Sabalenka's intensity on court, her explosive celebrations, her outspoken nature, qualities that made her a thrilling competitor, didn't necessarily translate to the kind of ambassador image that luxury brands sought. She wasn't the calm and composed figurehead that tech companies wanted. She wasn't the aspirational lifestyle model that fashion brands could build campaigns around. She was raw, she was authentic in her competitiveness, but she wasn't necessarily the kind of authentic that sold designer bags. By the time Eala's sponsorship explosion happened, Sabalenka's struggled endorsement landscape became impossible to ignore. The contrast illuminated the uncomfortable truth. The world number one player didn't command the world number one endorsement market, and that realization sent shockwaves through the entire sport. Some observers called it unfair, others called it the inevitable result of modern marketing forces, but everyone called it shocking, because in tennis, where meritocracy supposedly reigned supreme, where the best player was supposed to be rewarded with the biggest prizes and the most lucrative deals, the fundamental rules of the game had shifted without anyone announcing the rule change, and nobody, least of all Sabalenka, seemed prepared for it. The question everyone was asking: how did we get here? To understand why Eala suddenly became the most sought-after endorsement asset in women's tennis, you have to understand something fundamental about how brands actually think. They don't just look at rankings. They don't just analyze Grand Slam victories. They don't measure value the way tennis traditionalists measure it. Instead, they ask a single, ruthless question: who can access markets we haven't reached yet? This is where Eala became invaluable. The Philippines has a population of over 115 million people. It's a nation with a rapidly growing middle class, unprecedented smartphone penetration, and a ravenous appetite for sports content. It's also a market that had been largely neglected by major international brands in the context of professional women's tennis. There was no Filipino face on the global tennis stage, no one representing that massive population, no bridge between Eastern and Western sports markets. And then, suddenly, there was Eala. Sponsors didn't just see a tennis player, they saw a gateway. They saw a demographic that had been systematically underserved. They saw millions of potential consumers across the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, and the broader Southeast Asian region who would suddenly feel connected to international brands through Eala's presence. She wasn't just competing on the tennis court, she was opening economic corridors that had previously been closed. But it wasn't just geographical, it was generational. Eala represented something the tennis establishment had struggled to achieve: authentic Gen Z appeal. She wasn't being packaged by some corporate marketing department. She wasn't being artificially positioned as relatable. Her rise was organic. Her story was real. A young woman from a tennis-loving nation, grinding through the lower rankings, building her game, earning her place through pure determination. That narrative sold itself across TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, the platforms where Gen Z actually lived. She had viral potential. She had memeability. She had the kind of genuine human quality that couldn't be manufactured or bought. Compare this to the traditional approach. A player becomes a Grand Slam champion, brands attach themselves to that achievement, and the athlete becomes a billboard. It works. It's been the model for decades. But it's also saturated. The market for endorsing success is crowded. Every champion gets a luxury watch deal. Every major winner gets a sportswear contract. There's nothing distinctive about it. Everyone who wins gets the same formula. Eala broke that mold. She represented something brands desperately wanted but didn't know how to find: organic, authentic, undeniable market demand from an untapped demographic. She was the Emma Raducanu moment for Asian tennis, that breakout star whose success transcends sport and becomes a cultural phenomenon. When Raducanu won the US Open in 2021 as a qualifier, she didn't just earn a trophy, she earned the right to become one of the most marketable athletes in the world. Not because she was the best player, because she wasn't, but because she represented something new, something exciting, something with untapped commercial potential. Eala's sponsorship value operated on the exact same principle. Her ranking didn't matter. Her trophy case wasn't relevant. What mattered was what her presence could unlock for brands. A partnership with Eala wasn't just about putting her face on a product, it was about accessing entire markets. It was about building authentic relationships with demographics that had previously been peripheral to global sports marketing. It was about getting in front of 115 million Filipinos, hundreds of millions across Southeast Asia, and all of Gen Z globally who saw themselves in her story. The $600 million in sponsorships wasn't excessive or illogical when you understood the actual value proposition. Brands were making calculated, rational decisions based on market research, demographic data, and growth projections. They were investing in Eala not because she was the best tennis player, because she wasn't, but because she could access value that established stars couldn't. She could open doors, she could build audiences, she could create brand loyalty across regions that had previously been peripheral to global sports marketing, and she could do it all while remaining authentically herself. This is the uncomfortable lesson that Sabalenka's sponsorship struggle revealed. In the modern sports marketing landscape, traditional dominance doesn't equal commercial value. A Grand Slam champion doesn't automatically deserve the biggest deals. A world #1 ranking doesn't guarantee endorsement supremacy. The rules had changed, the metrics had shifted, and the players and the establishment were only now beginning to understand what that actually meant. What does it say about our sport when talent and achievement aren't the primary factors in determining financial reward? The backlash didn't come immediately. It came in waves. First, it was confusion. Then, it was disbelief. And finally, it became something much darker: anger. Because by the time the full scope of Eala's sponsorship dominance and Sabalenka's comparative absence became public knowledge, the narrative had solidified into something unavoidable. The world #1 player, the reigning Grand Slam champion, the woman who had defeated everyone in her path, was being out-earned and out-marketed by a player ranked nearly 20 positions lower, and nobody could adequately explain it why without sounding either absurd or deeply unjust.
The tennis community erupted. Social media became a battleground. Longtime fans of women's tennis took to Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit with their grievances. The discourse became heated, personal, and increasingly difficult to control. Some blamed Sabalenka's marketing team for being incompetent. Others blamed the sponsors for being short-sighted. Still others blamed the very structure of modern sports marketing for being fundamentally broken. But beneath all the noise was a deeper discomfort. Had the establishment fundamentally failed Aryna Sabalenka? Sabalenka had dominated women's tennis with a ferocity that was almost unmatched. She had won Grand Slams. She had held the world #1 ranking. She had beaten every top player in the world. She had done everything that tennis supposedly rewarded. And yet, when it came time for brands to allocate their massive sponsorship budgets, she found herself on the outside looking in. The injustice felt palpable. The disconnect between achievement and reward felt fundamentally wrong. Media outlets that had previously celebrated Sabalenka's dominance now began questioning the system that allowed this situation to develop. Major sports journalists wrote think pieces about the death of meritocracy in professional sports marketing. Tennis analysts publicly questioned whether the sponsorship landscape had become so market-driven, so algorithmic, so disconnected from actual athletic excellence that it had lost all connection to fairness and reward. Sponsors themselves began facing scrutiny. Why were they investing in Eala? Because the numbers said to. But those numbers were based on demographic analysis, market penetration studies, and growth projections, cold, calculated business metrics that had nothing to do with who was the better tennis player. That disconnect became a liability. Brands found themselves having to defend decisions that, on the surface, seemed to overlook the most dominant player in the sport. Sabalenka's own response to the situation became a secondary story. She didn't cry, she didn't complain publicly in ways that felt whiny or bitter. Instead, she did what she had always done. She let her tennis speak. But even that was complicated now, because every victory felt hollow without the corresponding endorsement deals. Every tournament win was a reminder that achievement and reward had become permanently separated in the modern sports marketplace. The narrative began shifting in disturbing ways. Some began suggesting that Sabalenka's Eastern European roots, her Ukrainian heritage, her Russian upbringing, were somehow limiting her marketability. Others whispered about her personality, her intensity, her perceived lack of relatability to Western audiences. These discussions were uncomfortable because they touched on issues of race, geography, and cultural identity in ways that sports marketing typically avoided. Meanwhile, Eala continued her meteoric rise, seemingly unbothered by the controversy swirling around her success. She was becoming the face of something new in women's tennis, a star who didn't have to earn her marketability through traditional means. She was marketable because of who she was, where she was from, and what she represented, not because of what she had accomplished on the court. That inversion of the traditional order troubled many. The empire that supposedly belonged to Sabalenka, the unchallenged dominance, the financial supremacy, the right to be the most valuable player in her sport, didn't exist anymore, and it had been dismantled not by a rival on the tennis court, but by market forces she couldn't control, metrics she couldn't influence, and a world that had decided her achievements weren't the currency that mattered most. When a champion loses everything except the title, is she really still champion?
But here's where the story transcends simple drama and becomes something more instructive. Because Eala didn't just stumble into the sponsorship bonanza. She didn't accidentally become the most marketable player in women's tennis. What she did was conduct a masterclass in modern athlete branding, one that, if you look closely, reveals fundamental truths about how value is created in contemporary sports. First, understand that Eala's rise happened at exactly the right moment. The tennis world had been searching for the next big global star. There had been attempts to manufacture stars, to push certain narratives, to build certain players into icons, but nothing had worked authentically. Until Eala. She arrived at a moment when markets were desperate for representation, when brands were hungry for authenticity, and when the traditional pathways to tennis stardom had become predictable and saturated. She filled a void that nobody else could. Second, Eala understood something crucial that many established stars didn't. Her story was her brand. She didn't try to become something she wasn't. She didn't attempt to adopt the persona of a Western sports superstar. She remained proudly, defiantly Filipino. She represented her nation. She carried the hopes of an entire region that had been historically absent from global sports conversation. That authenticity was magnetic. Brands could build entire campaigns around it. Sponsors could invest in it with genuine enthusiasm because it felt real. Third, and this is perhaps most important, Ayla benefited from timing and market forces that she didn't create, but that she immediately understood to leverage. The shift toward Asian market dominance in global commerce, the rise of Gen Z consumer power, the increasing sophistication of data analytics in identifying market opportunities. All of these factors existed independently of Ayla, but she positioned herself directly in their path. She became the athlete that all of these trends pointed toward. What makes Ayla's rise particularly instructive is what it reveals about the future of sports marketing. She's essentially proven that a player doesn't need to be the best to be the most valuable. A player doesn't need to win grand slams to command massive endorsement deals. A player doesn't need years of established success to become the face of global brands. What they need is to occupy a space that markets desperately want to fill and to do so authentically. This is liberation and threat, depending on your perspective. For younger players like Ayla, it's liberation, proof that the traditional path to athletic stardom is no longer the only path. You don't have to win your way to wealth and influence. You can build your way. You can market your way. You can leverage global forces that have nothing to do with tournament rankings. But for established stars, it's a threat. Because if a player can become the most commercially valuable player in the sport without being the best player, then what's the actual incentive to win Grand Slams? What's the actual benefit of dominance? This is the uncomfortable question that Sabalenka's situation forces us to confront. Ayla's masterclass also revealed something about the tennis community's own biases and blind spots. For decades, women's tennis had been marketed primarily to established tennis fans, people who understood rankings, who followed tour schedules, who could appreciate the technical nuances of the game. But Ayla opened a door to something different, marketing women's tennis to people who didn't care about rankings, who had never watched a Grand Slam, who simply saw a young woman from their country achieving on a global stage. That's an infinitely larger audience. That's where the real commercial value lives. The sponsorship deals weren't just about Ayla's likability or her story, though those were crucial. They were about her ability to access markets that traditional tennis players couldn't. They were about her function as a bridge between worlds, Eastern and Western, tennis traditionalists and digital natives, developed markets and emerging markets. She was worth $600 million not because she was the best tennis player, but because she was something far more valuable, a gateway. Has Ayla accidentally uncovered the future of women's sports or exposed a fundamental flaw in how we value achievement? We're living in a moment of profound transformation in women's tennis. The sport is being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between excellence, achievement, and commercial value. The old rules, the ones that suggested the best player should be the richest, the most dominant should be the most marketable, the champion should be the icon, those rules are dead. They're not just challenged, they're not just questioned, they're demonstrably, irrefutably dead. Ayla didn't kill them. Market forces did. But Ayla's spectacular rise is the evidence we can no longer ignore. What we're witnessing is the emergence of a new paradigm in professional sports, particularly in women's tennis. The paradigm works like this. Commercial value is determined not by what you've accomplished, but by what you can unlock. Not by who you've beaten, but by who you can reach. Not by trophies won, but by markets accessed. This is the future, and the sooner the tennis establishment accepts it, the sooner it can adapt. Sabalenka will continue to be a great player. She may win more Grand Slams. She may extend her time at world number one. But her dominance on the court no longer guarantees corresponding dominance in the marketplace. That separation, once unthinkable, is now permanent. It's baked into the new reality, and every player coming up through the ranks will understand this implicitly. You can be the best and still not be the richest. You can win everything and still not be the most valuable. The metrics have changed. The scoreboard has shifted. For Ayla, the pressure is now different. She has to deliver not just on the court, but in the real world. Her value is predicated on maintaining her market relevance, her authenticity, her connection to the audiences and demographics that made her marketable in the first place. If she loses that, if she becomes just another tennis player focused solely on rankings and titles, her sponsorship empire could evaporate as quickly as it was built. The deal she's made with market forces is transactional. She must continue to be valuable to remain valuable. For traditional powers like Sabalenka, the adjustment is even more difficult because accepting that rankings don't equal commercial power means accepting a fundamental diminishment of your status. It means understanding that you're the best at something that nobody particularly cares to pay for. That's psychologically devastating in ways that losing matches never is. But there's a deeper lesson in all of this that transcends Ayla and Sabalenka. It's about the future of meritocracy in professional sports. If commercial success is no longer tied to athletic dominance, what incentives exist for players to actually win? What's the motivation to sacrifice, to grind, to push yourself to the absolute edge of human capability when someone younger, more marketable, with better demographics can earn more without doing any of it? This is the existential question that women's tennis must grapple with now, and it doesn't have an easy answer. Some would argue that players like Sabalenka should pivot their approach, focus less on winning Grand Slams and more on building their personal brands, engaging with social media, developing a persona that brands find appealing. But that's fundamentally asking athletes to devalue the thing they've dedicated their lives to achieving. It's asking them to be entrepreneurs before they're competitors, and that's a profound shift from how traditional sports organizations have operated. Others would argue that the sponsorship market itself needs correction, that brands are being short-sighted by investing in potential rather than proven excellence, that they're making poor decisions by prioritizing demographic access over quality of product. But the market data consistently contradicts this argument. Ayla's sponsorship value isn't misplaced. It's precisely calibrated based on actual market demand and potential revenue generation. The truth is probably more nuanced and more troubling. We're in a transitional moment where the old rules no longer apply, but the new rules haven't been fully established. Players like Sabalenka are caught in that gap, still operating under the old paradigm where winning matters most, while the world has shifted toward a paradigm where marketability matters most. And players like Eala are riding the wave of transformation, benefiting enormously from being in the right place at the right moment with the right profile. What comes next is unclear. Will tennis adapt by embracing the new commercial reality? Will it fight back by trying to restore the connection between achievement and reward? Will the gap between player rankings and player wealth continue to widen until there's virtually no relationship between the two? We don't know yet, but what we do know is that women's tennis will never be the same. The contract between excellence and success has been broken, and nobody, not Sabalenka, not Eala, not the tennis establishment, can put it back together. The question isn't if this is fair. The question is whether fairness matters when market forces have spoken so clearly. And that's a question that will define professional women's tennis for the next decade. Is Ayla's rise proof that the sport has evolved beyond traditional meritocracy, or proof that something fundamental about how we value women's sports has gone profoundly wrong? Alex Eala snatched $600 million in sponsorships in 1 month. Arna Sabalenka, the world number one, couldn't secure comparable deals. This isn't a story about one player's triumph or another's failure. It's a story about a sport in transformation, reckoning with what it means to be valuable in an age where rankings don't equal worth, where achievement doesn't guarantee reward, and where the future belongs to those who can unlock new markets rather than those who have dominated old